Hey, Barbara. Nancy Mooney, famous last name. You any relation to James Mooney? Guy who did the Ghost Dance book? Hey, folks. Hey, Nancy. Baton Rouge. It's warm as that here. North Dakota. Yeah, follow the money, that's for sure. Oh, you're going by so fast I can't see you. Hey, Barbara. Um, so welcome here. Is it National Pumpkin Day? Oh, I'm sorry I missed that. Um, Welcome back to a politics chat for today, which is October 26th. I'll get with the program in just a minute. And I'm going to be a little bit brief today because I have to be on the other side of the city to give a talk, and I'm a little concerned about traffic. But I hadn't checked in a couple of weeks because of my normal schedule and while I'm teaching. And I saw somebody say, she's weaning us off these talks. And the truth is that I really enjoy these, and I hope to continue them. So I wanted to make sure you knew I was there. Hey, Gita, welcome. Hi from Portland. I'm actually not in I'm not in Maine today. I'm in Massachusetts. Anyway, so let me get to some of your questions because they're cool ones. And I'm going to do the best I can with them. As I say, I'm kind of like, that proverbial one-armed paper hanger right now this week because I've been speaking in all kinds of different places. And all that being said, if you have not watched or listened to either the live video or the podcast that Joanne Freeman and I did with Carol Anderson last week, you really should. And I put in my Facebook post, I don't advertise what I do. I figure it's there. If people find it, that's fine. But every once in a while, as a creator, you hit a home run. And they're really rare. I mean, I can probably count them on maybe two hands in a 30-year career. And that was one of them. So I'd urge you to hear that. I mean, it's horrifying, but it was really cool. All right, so let me get to some of your questions. Rachel Keeney has suggested that she'd like to hear more about Biden and what Biden is up to. And I'm really glad to get that question because I keep trying every night to write about Biden, and it's very difficult to do because one of the things that you're seeing right now with the Biden administration, and one of the things that is, I think, the larger story of American democracy is that when people are doing things the right way, it's not very noticeable. That's like when you're in your office and there's just people who are getting their jobs done. And because they're just getting their jobs done, you're not paying any attention to them. So it's harder to pay attention to people who are just doing what they're supposed to do, because the whole point is if they're doing it right, you don't see it. Whereas if people are royally screwing up, well, yeah, then it's headline news. So our problem right now, and has been for a long time now, since before the Trump administration really, is that people just doing their jobs don't get a lot of attention. And on that front, I'm going to talk about Biden in a second, but as an illustration of this, one of the things that really jumped out to me when I was writing my history of the Republican Party was that, George H.W. Bush had been the director of the CIA, and he was very involved in global issues, really. And nobody gives him a ton of credit for not gloating over the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, you think of what our country and the world might have looked like had a Donald Trump or even a Ronald Reagan and certainly a George W. Bush been in office when the Soviet Union had collapsed. It would have been very, very difficult to see the outcome we had there been a president going, nah, we told you. And George H.W. Bush did not do that. And you don't write books about things people don't do, but that's really important, what people don't do. So Biden, anyway, what's going on right now with Biden, as near as I can tell, I have no inside track, is that he is recognizing the extraordinary polarization of this moment in American history, which is not new. Everybody's like, oh, it's just brand new. It is not. And it's not even unique to Trump. It actually went back before that. You start to see what Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, called positive polarization. That is the deliberate attempt to divide Americans in two, because what you do when you divide Americans in two is you get your voters really riled up. And that's what Nixon needed especially after the Kent State shooting of May of 1970, when he lost the sort of middle class Americans whose kids were in college. And when he comes out and he suggests that those kids who were killed by the National Guard there were, as he called them, thugs, that really turned a lot of middle America against him. And when that happens, the Nixon administration doubles down on this policy of positive polarization. So that's as recently as 1970. And of course, since then, Ronald Reagan took it and ran with it. And even George H.W. Bush, who tried very hard not to push the polarization, found during the summer of, is it 88? Yeah, 88? No, yes, 88, when he is running when he is running 17 points behind Michael Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen from Texas in the summer of that election year. That's when he turns to the Willie Horton ad, which was a deliberate attempt to polarize the country, and it worked. I mean, he got elected based on it. The person who was responsible for that ad, Lee Atwater, political operative, horrific political operative, does actually apologize on his deathbed for that. And Michael Dukakis, there's a video of him on YouTube in which he talks about that. And he uses the only word that you can use for that, and that is despicable, which is what it was. Very misleading. And I could tell you more about that if you wanted to, but you wanted to know more, but you want to know other stuff. Okay, so Biden recognizes that there is this polarization, but there is an issue with hitting back a bully. And it's this. And to me, I always think of it spatially. If you continue to fight back against a bully, you are permitting that bully to define the terms of the argument. So you can't move beyond it. And so even if you are pushing back against a bully, if you are responding to that bully still dominates the space because you are accepting his terms. So if you take that intellectual concept and you take it to American politics, Biden is really clearly, deliberately trying not to engage with the Trump Republicans, or even the establishment Republicans, who are trying again and again and again to bait him, because the minute that he responds to them, he is accepting their terms of the debate. So what he's trying to do, at least this is my read of the situation, is to say, this is not my problem. My problem is not the January 6th committee, the select committee in the House. That belongs to the House. My problem is not the prosecutions. That belongs to the Department of Justice. And he's sort of going through the different aspects of things that are absolutely in the news. And rather than saying, yeah, that guy's a jerk and he's doing this, he's trying not to respond. He's trying instead to focus attention on the stuff that the Democrats are doing. And if you could actually get attention on the stuff that isn't getting headlines because it's not horrific, the Biden administration has already been an extraordinary success. And let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, the vaccines. And this is really interesting to me. So if you think about the former administration, the Donald John Trump administration, I've been writing, so I'm constructing sentences in my head. The Trump administration, it claimed it had, and you may not remember this, I do because I wrote about it a number of times. They claimed to have a plan to distribute the vaccines. And if you remember, there was a place in the administration during the transition period when the Trump appointees would not start the process of transitioning to the Biden administration. That's a huge problem in America, because in many countries what they do is they have a shadow government, so that if you're not in power, you're at least privy to what's going on in power, so that if voters choose your party the next time around, you're ready to go. We don't have that. So what we have is this really short, relatively short period where an administration needs to get up to speed really fast on what's happening in the country. And the Trump administration wouldn't let that happen. Finally, they go ahead and they let some of the Biden people in to see what's going on. And they're horrified. And they're like, there's no plan here for distributing a vaccine. And at that point, it was a really interesting moment, because Alex Azar came, who was in charge of the vaccines in the Trump administration. I'm drawing a blank on his title at this point. He came out and said, well, that's a lie. We had one. And he gives this really convincing speech. I was convinced by it. And I thought, wow, they really had something. And he's saying they really had something. And then later on, it comes out, there wasn't anything. He was just lying. And it was such a convincing lie that even cynical me was like, oh, yeah, they must have had a plan. Their plan was this: to go ahead and take the vaccines into and give them to state governments. That's it. And if you think about the logistics of getting shots into people's arms all across the country, and you look at the logistics of the states at the time, which were desperately short of money because of the coronavirus pandemic. Now that's played out a little differently over time, but at the time they were terribly short of money. How the expletive was that going to happen? I mean, literally, how were the vaccines going to be refrigerated? Remember, the Pfizer's needed to be refrigerated. How were they going to move from one place to another? How were you going to tell people where they were? How were you going to get the stuff you needed to get them into arms? I mean, it was mind-boggling that the idea was, we're going to put these in the States and you go for it. And the obvious answer to that was they were hoping and expecting that private corporations would figure out there was a way to make money doing this and they would go ahead and do it. But that's not necessarily an answer. So when I say the Biden administration was a success, Biden, to my mind, and I'm going to use words like clearly, this is my vision, and somebody else could actually have access to the inner circles and be like, she's crazy. This is what I saw. What I saw was an administration, and remember, Biden is, I'm going to be very flippant here, 6 million years old. So he remembers the period before the Reagan administration when the government actually did stuff. I mean, he's really kind of an old-fashioned, or he was an old-fashioned New Deal Democrat. I think he's something entirely else now, something new, which is actually quite exciting. But he was like, we're going to make this work. And we're going to show people that the government can work. So if you remember, the ramp up to getting shots into people's arms was extraordinary. They got him out, they got him into people's arms, and everything was going just fine. And he started to say, this is great. We're going to, prove that the government can work, and we're going to stop this pandemic. And when we stop the pandemic, the economy is going to take off again, which is, if you sort of remember, like June of this year, that's the way it looked like things were going to go. But that's the point at which Republican governors, especially, and Republican pundits started to say, "Ooh, we don't know about these vaccines, and we don't, we don't think you need a vaccine." And my personal guess, they made a calculation that the Democrats and people around them would get enough of the vaccines that there would be enough immunity that they could sort of keep it bubbling on low and keep their base angered up without there being huge death rates. And then, of course, the Delta virus comes, and the Delta just burns through those places where there have not been vaccines. And so this is how we get this really bizarre thing where you have Republicans doubling down on the idea that we don't need vaccines, we don't need mask mandates, at the same time that extraordinary numbers of their own people are dying. And now, if you read, you probably didn't, but I was reading this morning about the Republicans' plans for the 2022 election. They want to argue that Biden didn't manage to accomplish didn't manage to get us away from the pandemic. That we're, people are still dying. Well, of course they're still dying because the Republicans are telling them not to get a vaccine. The politicization of this vaccine is absolutely extraordinary. So anyway, Biden, first of all, has this extraordinary success with the vaccine. And then he gets through the American Rescue Plan almost immediately. And the American Rescue Plan was mind-boggling to people like me because the American Rescue Plan was a huge sum of money. And I don't remember now how much it was. I want to say $3 trillion, but I have no notes on that. And I've spent the day in the 1860s. So my mind's kind of not in the present right now. But this is this huge, it just goes through. And the Republicans, if you remember, spent their time, rather than talking about that plan And when you go to negotiate a big plan, you ask for everything. I mean, Bernie Sanders for this next infrastructure plan where he wanted $6 trillion. Yeah, you ask big, and then it whittles down, and you're lucky to get half. And that's just the way it is. That's how it always happens. And the Republicans didn't negotiate at all with the American Rescue Plan. So you could sort of see people like Biden and some of the negotiators being like, really? Like, you're really going to spend your time talking about, if you recall, Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Potato Head and the non-gendered potato kin or whoever they were? By the way, originally those pieces literally went into a real potato. And you're going to be talking about the fact that the Dr. Seuss estate has removed from publication some of its less popular titles, because in part they're less popular because they're so incredibly racist. That's a decision of a private corporation to go in both cases to go ahead and chase their markets. That's really what you're going to be trying to take headline news from? And that measure just flew through. I mean, it was mind-boggling. It is a huge deal, a huge deal. And remember, for example, within it, it had those child tax credits, which are like, people have been trying to get those child tax credits for forever. And there are, not literally, but they were a really big deal. So already Biden's got the attempt to get the shots into arms, even though the Republicans are doing everything that they possibly can not to, and that's been a big success. He's got that American Rescue Plan, and then the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is really interesting because the media play of it was, oh, this is a crisis, this is a crisis. No one was paying any attention in the media to what was happening in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I know for a fact, because I actually care quite a bit about the military. And, I always used to say to my students, please, in every holiday, please don't forget, we have people in uniform around the world fighting for our freedoms. And the students were always like, yeah. And I'm like, yes. And we would talk about Afghanistan. And they heard about it so little, they weren't even aware of it. Not really. I mean, it was sort of out there. So the issue behind Afghanistan, the story behind Afghanistan was that, of course, the Trump administration was desperately eager to pull out of those wars, which were not popular at all, because we seemed to be pouring money, and we were pouring money into them, and they just seemed to be out there, and no one seemed to be paying much attention to them. He knew that. So he went to withdraw from Afghanistan, but the issue with the withdrawal from Afghanistan was different from the withdrawal from Syria, in that theoretically, and there's a long history in Afghanistan, but we were in Afghanistan at that point by the invitation of the Afghan government. And if you remember, under George W. Bush, the mission in Afghanistan changed really dramatically after the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the Capitol building, which the plane came down in Pennsylvania thanks to the people who were aboard and who crashed the plane rather than take out the Capitol, which is one of the reasons that the attack on the Capitol was so heart-wrenching to me, that people had given their lives to protect that building, and here were these thugs in it. But after that attack, we went into Afghanistan because the Taliban, which was running Afghanistan at the time, had protected al-Qaeda. And so they were giving shelter to the terrorists. And we began a bombing campaign against the camps, the al-Qaeda centers in Afghanistan. And very quickly, the Afghanistan government, the Taliban began to back off. And they said, we'll provide trials. And Bush was like, yeah, right. And then finally they offered an unconditional surrender. And by then, the Bush administration said, no, we're going to actually go ahead and we're going to rebuild Afghanistan. And so they go ahead and they help the development of the Afghan government. And the Afghan government then, in turn, invited the U.S. military to come stay. So we're in Afghanistan during the Trump administration. And I'm going to do a jump here to the Trump administration, by the invitation of the Afghan government. But when we sit down to try and get our troops out, the negotiators don't have the Afghan government at the table. They negotiate with the Taliban, which is so mind-boggling. I can still remember driving. I was listening to the BBC and I was driving, And I'm listening to this thinking, wait a minute, I've missed a piece. We're negotiating with the Taliban and the Afghan government's not at the table. And that's exactly what happened. And the idea was that we were going to cut a deal with the Taliban, and then the Afghan government was going to cut their own deal with the Taliban. But of course, the minute we cut a deal with the Taliban, which was, by the way, very difficult for the negotiators, because during their talks, Trump actually tweeted that we were going to be leaving. So, there goes your leverage, right? So we came up with a negotiation. It was on February 29th of that year. I always remember because it's Sadie Hawkins Day. That we would get out of Afghanistan, and I don't remember the date off the top of my head. I want to say it was May, something really early. So long as the the Taliban did certain things, which they never did, and in exchange, the Afghan government, which hadn't been party to the deal, would release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, some of who went on to become ranking figures in the current government there. Anyway, so when so Trump has said we're going to go out, we're going to leave, we're going to go out, and the deal was that if we did that, the Taliban wasn't going to hurt any Americans, and they didn't. They stopped hurting Americans, and that's a really important piece to remember, because when Biden looks at the situation there, he knows that if the troops stay, he's going to start losing people, because the Taliban, which is now way stronger, is going to start killing Americans again. And it's going to be on his head. And the other piece to that I think is really important is that of all the presidents who were involved in Afghanistan, and that's going to be George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, Joe Biden's the one who's had sons in that war. He's had people in uniform, and he gets what that means. So he was inclined to get out anyway. He didn't want Obama to go ahead and do the surge that he did when he was president. And Biden was upset by that when, for some reason, this always kicks me out. Hold on. He didn't want Obama to do the surge, and of course he was perfectly happy to get on his own. He does lengthen that amount of time to expect to get out, and the security people missed, of course, that the Afghan troops were going to fold, in part because the Trump administration had pulled so many people out. By the time that I think there were about 15,000 troops there when Trump cut the deal. Maybe it was 25,000. It was in the low tens of thousands. And by the time Biden took over, there were about 2,500 people left. So he really didn't have a lot of choice. And the spin, the Republican spin, and to some degree the media spin that this was this great disaster is indicative, I think, of how different people think about things depending on how it's been spun. Because at the end of the day, that was an extraordinary airlift, never before attempted or successful in American history, that got out of Afghanistan. Hundreds, more than 100,000 of our people and our allies. And mind you, the Trump administration was just going to leave our allies behind, and at the loss of the horrific loss of 13 U.S. troops. But again, in the scheme of things, it was this something that would go in the books, and I think will go in the history books as a success. It's been spun very differently. All right, so if that's what Biden is up to, what's going on right now? I really think that what Biden is doing, certainly with this infrastructure package, but also with the way he is managing the government, is that he is trying to restore the concept of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but he is not trying to restore the government that Ronald Reagan began to dismantle and that successive Republican presidents have tried to dismantle. Because the FDR government was one that really privileged white male heads of households. So you're a worker, you should be able to support your family, and by that, a worker, in parentheses, white, right? And by that, I mean that the laws were written in such a way that people of color rarely got the benefits of the New Deal. They got some for sure, and a lot of people of color switched their votes to FDR. And of course, that really not began, but was in the middle point of the Democrats the black vote, for example, switching from Republicans to Democrats. But FDR was really focusing on that nuclear male-headed family, usually white. I think Biden is doing something very different. And that comes from the fact that in the 1970s, the Democrats and the Republicans both, but in very different ways, began to grapple with the true meaning of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what that Voting Rights Act does in 65, and then later in 75, when it's expanded to create ballots that are available multilingually, is it really says we mean it. We mean everybody gets to vote. And of course, the Democrats are going to ramp that up in 1993 with the Motor Voter Act as well. But there are two ways to handle that. You can do what the Republicans did after 72, really starting in 70 and then after 72, which is say, we're going to double down on the white vote. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep saying, hey, things were much better before you started letting these people vote. And by these people, I'm going to include not only people of color, but also feminist women and labor organizers, who are trying to restore a government that responds to people lower in the bottom of the economic ladder. So the Republicans double down on getting rid of that. The Democrats really explicitly, in a document that nobody has read probably, but it matters, say we need better representation in the Democratic Party and also in government. We need to go ahead and make sure women are represented and people of color are represented. And of course, that gives fodder for the Republicans to say, oh, look, they're all special interests over there. But I feel like Biden is really listening to that and really putting into place the idea that Americans in general should have a say in their government. And that's why, if you look at the American Rescue Plan to some degree, but also this new infrastructure package, there's the bipartisan package, which is roads and bridges that everybody wants. Even some Republicans, not many, but even some. And then there is this larger infrastructure package. And the larger infrastructure package, like the American Rescue Plan, really focuses not on families headed by men, but rather on children and their parents, regardless of their marital status or anything else. It focuses on children. And if you think about the reordering that means for society, that really centers society really differently than when it was centered on men and on white men. So I think that's what Biden is up to, why he's pushing so hard. And of course, part of that is the idea of combating climate change. And the idea of combating climate change is quite frankly a no-brainer if you look, aside from any of the obvious, like the world is burning, if you actually look at the bottom lines of companies that no longer call themselves oil companies, they call themselves energy companies. This is obviously the direction of the future. But for us to switch over to protecting the environment is going to mean a movement of certain industries, the coal industry, for example. And it's also such a hot button issue for culturally, because again, the Republicans since Reagan have doubled down on the idea that somehow taking care of the environment is, some lefty thing, which is really interesting because of course it was the Republicans first who began the whole idea of protecting the environment, but it has become a real issue culturally. And so this is making it harder for Biden to get that through. And it's just imperative. So, all right, so that's probably more than you wanted to hear about Biden. Oh, and Rachel, I'm sorry to have hammered this. The issue, of course, is voting, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. All right. Where else can I go here that is fairly quick? Oh, here we go. Yeah, I'm real concerned about this. Lisa has asked about the disruption of local town meetings and school committee meetings. And I'm really worried about this. And I'm really worried about it because first of all, because they're not organic. And you know that. You know that because they're all saying the same things. They're being trained by certain so-called conservative groups. I say they're radical groups that are backed by big money, including a number of organizations, take money from the Koch Foundation. And And why do I worry about these? Because of this. And this is a new way of thinking about the rise of fascism. And by the way, I don't think we're at a fascist moment in America. I think we're at a moment of autocracy, which is, and I just say that for my purposes right now, that doesn't really matter. But it does matter for people who are theoreticians of American politics or of politics in general, which I am. So I always kind of like to throw that out there. If you care someday, I will explain the difference between the two. You don't want either of them, I promise you. But the way, so how do you radicalize people, right? Like most of us are going about our lives. And if you come to me and you say, I really don't think the way this government works is right, and what we really need to do is this, and people are going to tune out. So what do you do to radicalize people? You say, hey, people are coming for your kids, right? Like, who wouldn't respond? People are coming for your kids. They're coming for your kids as pedophiles. QAnon. They're coming for your kids with this dangerous, scary thing called critical race theory that teaches them to hate themselves. That's completely made up. Critical race theory is a legal theory from the 1970s designed to answer a specific question. And it's not taught K through 12 anyway, and it's rarely taught in colleges. It is primarily taught, except in debate clubs, which is kind of a different story. It's taught in law schools. So, but that idea, we're coming for your kids. We're coming for your kids with this mask mandate. We're making them look like somebody else, like the star that Nazis made Jews wear. All these really scary sounding, emotionally based cries. And you can see people getting really worked up about that. They're coming for my kid, teaching my kid to hate themselves, right? So that radicalization of people around specific issues, almost always involving children, is the way that you create communities that then can be politically radicalized. So, hey, you don't want mask mandates in this school? Neither do I. They're taking away our liberties. And you know what else they're doing? They're letting the wrong people vote. And we need to get behind this movement to make sure those people can't vote. And you start down a path from which the violence is the beginning and the political radicalization comes later. Lots of people think it's the other way around. The political radicalization comes first. But really, you get people into the streets. And once they have bonded like that, that's how you then turn them into political radicals. And there's a wonderful discussion from a military figure in which he talks about how people who have returned from the wars are susceptible to this because they're used to being bonded. And they're likely to spend time with other people like themselves, and they are ripe for radicalization. And once you have made them feel like they're a member of brotherhoods, man, they'll do anything. And think about what that means. I mean, we think of the people in your lives that you would do anything for. And sometimes they ask you to do some really stupid things. I hope it doesn't mean that they mean for you to go storm the Capitol, but they might say, geez, I need a ride from the airport. I'm sorry, it's 2 a.m. Will you do it? The answer is I would absolutely not do it for some stranger, but sure. One of my best friends says, please get me at the airport at 2:00. I wouldn't even hesitate, right? So that's why I worry about that radicalization, because it's not about CRT. It is not about mask mandates. It is not about the first thing I thought of, which I can't think of now, which are all completely reasonable responses to education and to trying to protect our children from their own, from this pandemic. Those are utterly reasonable things. They are established by our traditions. They're established by our law. These are not extraordinary things at all. But if you can whip that up, then you can radicalize them. So I'm really concerned about that. All right, so what else? So I have to laugh. Corey said, did I pass my summer class? Well, what's funny about that, and I like I say, I'm hoping to develop an actual class here, not for pay and not for grade, but that takes you from one place to another. But often you people say that, you'd love to take one of my classes. you are, so don't worry about that, except that I'm much less constrained when I do these than when I'm in a classroom, because in a classroom, my goal is to get students to think for themselves. Here, my goal is to give you information that enable, because I'm kind of assuming you can think for yourselves. So anyway, all right. Ellen asked about the filibuster. So this is a great question. If the filibuster is not ended, could it be restored to its original form? And the answer is yes. And my guess is that's what we're going to see. We're going to see for voting rights, maybe a carve out, which personally I would love to see, if we can carve out the Supreme Court like Mitch McConnell did when he was majority leader. And that's how we got Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and Neil, whatever his name is. Oh, come on. Crap, I can see him and I can't think of his name. Anyway, those three that came in under Trump. We certainly should do it for voting rights. I mean, it's just a no-brainer to me. There is reluctance to do so on the Democratic side, which, again, like I say, the Republicans will do it in the drop of a hat. So why we feel that that's a bad thing to do is a little bit beyond me. But the original filibuster, you had to talk constantly. You couldn't give up the floor. You had to have a certain number of people on the floor all the time. So you couldn't just have one guy, sort of tag teaming off, you talk for 8 hours, then I'll come in and I'll talk for 8 hours. You actually had to be there. And there's all kinds of ways that we could turn it into a real filibuster again, instead of what it is now, where all you have to do is say, yeah, I'm gonna filibuster that. And that's how the minority party, which is really quite a small minority in terms of the voters in this country, have managed to stop all kinds of legislation that the rest of us want. All right, so yes, that could happen. I'm sorry, Sharon asked about Afghanistan. I think I answered that. Okay, this is a great question from Phil. Are the school board recalls tied into the idea of destroying public education? Absolutely. Bingo. Yes. And this is something really important, because if you think about the concept of public education, it does a number of things. First of all, theoretically, it educates individuals in such a way that they are able accurately to gauge information and to make good decisions when they go to the ballot box. Right there. First of all. Second, though, what public education does is it establishes the concept of a common good, and it establishes the concept that we are all in this together. And if indeed we all go to the same public schools, we cross, if in fact there's a lot of caveats to this, but studies everywhere say that if students go to school with people across racial, ethnic, gender, and class lines, they are far more tolerant than if they don't. So what do you do? What you do is in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the Supreme Court requires public school desegregation, what you do is you say, not my kid. My kid's going to go to a special academy. And this is where we got the rise of what became known as segregation academies across the South. The idea that you had these schools that were white schools, essentially. And those segregation academies developed from that point into largely Christian academies. And Christian academies now that take one or two token or a few token people of color, but retain this basis in race. Now, the kicker to that is it's expensive to send your kid to a public school. And by the way, I'm not against public schools at all. I mean, private schools at all. I'm very pro public schools. I'm not against private schools at all. I went to one for some of my high school years. For complicated reasons, but I think that's reasonable. But I also think that if you make that choice, you should pay for it, because the public schools are right there. And what the movement with the school voucher movement is, and there's a number of kind of ways that this has happened, starting with the segregation academies. They're trying to take public monies, that is taxpayer money that normally would go to the public schools, pull it out and give it to private schools. And you see this, the privatization of our public school system increasingly now as a way for people to make money. And what they do, of course, is that means that they're not regulated, which might mean they're great or it might mean that they're terrible. And they can choose who they take. And they are, of course, not pushing the ideas that we're all in this together, because we're not if you're in a private school. And they are also certainly not reinforcing the idea of the public good, because the whole point is they don't believe in the public good. So you can actually see a number of lawmakers now talking about how this idea of pull your kids out of the school and put them in private schools. That's exactly what they're telling people to do, because if you can destroy the public schools, you are not only destroying the potential ability for people to be able to evaluate their world, you are preventing them from developing a sense of community and a sense of toleration across community. And you're also managing to destroy the concept of the public good. This is a huge fight, and one of these days I'm going to be writing about it. But I will point out that one of the things that Abraham Lincoln talks about when he talks about the survival of government that is based in the common good is the promotion of education. And it's until Ronald Reagan, one of the key goals of the Republican Party was widespread public education. And why we wouldn't, I mean, to me, it's just such a no-brainer. You want people to be educated, because then, as Lincoln said, they produce and they contribute more to society because they're innovative and they can do more and they can think better, but also because they're better consumers of information. We know it just reduces all kinds of societal problems. So yes, that's exactly it. A number of people are asking why, two more things, and then I got to run. People are asking why people like Bannon aren't in jail yet. First of all, he's not in jail for what he did with the scam build the wall thing, because Trump pardoned him. And currently, anyway, a presidential pardon is a get out of jail free card. He's not in jail, as are none of the other people whose names have been coming up with regard to the January 6th insurrection, because so far he hasn't been charged with anything. Those who have been charged are in jail. The low-level people, so far, is all they've gotten up to. And the cases are, of course, still in front of the Department of Justice. And it's really important that we continue to maintain the legality of our system. Because sure, I look as a historian at what I'm seeing out of January 6th, and sure, I couldn't write a damning book yet because we don't have all the evidence. And I know that sounds crazy because your gut says, as mine does, of course X congressperson was involved, but I don't yet have that evidence. Probably somebody does, but I don't. So you want that system to play out, because the minute that you say, well, we can just jump to the chase here, you are denying the validity of that system. And then anything goes, because I might say, yeah, I think she's guilty. And she might say, yeah, I think she's guilty, back to me. And if we don't have a system of evidence and prosecution and trial and all that, it's not a question of who's right, it's a question of who has power. So that's why that hasn't happened yet. That being said, oh shoot, I was going to go some direction with that. Lots of people are talking to the committee because it's better to talk voluntarily, because then you get to determine when and how long you talk and all that. So a lot of that is going on. The real question is, one of the problems I think you have watching this is that there's so many moving pieces. So please don't forget that hanging out there is not only this thing with Bannon, and that's frustrating, I know, but there's like all these weird steps that the Congress has to take. There's got to be this lag before you can take a vote to do this, and which again makes sense. You want to slow this stuff down generally. But please don't forget that there's the number of problems that former members of the Trump administration are in is myriad. So, for example, don't forget Tom Barrack out there. Tom Barrack, one of the key players in the Trump administration and a key backer of Jared Kushner, who has been indicted on a bucket load of charges and was clearly the liaison between the Trump administration, the United Arab Emirates, and the Saudis. He's still hanging out there, whatever he's talking about. Joel Greenberg in Florida, who is the person who's been pleaded guilty to sex trafficking, the person that Matt Gaetz of Florida called his wingman, is still giving evidence to prosecutors. He has just gone ahead and had his sentencing put off because he still isn't done talking. There's all sorts of stuff that is out there. It just takes time to do these cases. And at the end of the day, a prosecutor wants an open and shut case if they can possibly have it. I will say I would love to be part of the team that's piecing all this together. I really would. But so one of the things that jumped out at me last night, if you read my letters, is I had never put this together before. Once you actually put Gosar into people expected Paul Gosar of Arizona was in deep for many reasons. But he talked 15 minutes over the time they were supposed to evacuate the house. And that, of course, is what made Ashley Babbitt endanger the people in Congress, and she was shot by a police officer. Pieces like that are going to continue to come out. Maybe it was an accident. You got to always start there, but maybe it wasn't. And so one of the things I'm watching as I watch this is not what people are saying. Oh, that's what I was going to say to you. People are like, why isn't the mainstream media talking about the Rolling Stone article? Because quite frankly, the Rolling Stone article told us only one thing. We knew all of that other stuff. We knew, and we have guesses about who gave the interview to Rolling Stone. What that Rolling Stone interview told us was that somebody who was part of that first rally at the Ellipse that morning is talking to the committee. That's what it told us. The rest of it, the fact that that person named names about planning, we knew that. We knew that they were planning. The question is, what were they planning? If they were just planning that women to make America great or whatever it's called, if that's all they were planning, that's perfectly legal. Yeah, you can plan a rally. They had a permit. So that's not a big deal. The bigger deal is who was involved with what came after. And that article didn't say. Now, it implied a lot, but it didn't say that. So what I took from that article was only that somebody on the inside admitted to talking to the committee. What they say to the committee, we don't know yet. And that's why it's not being, lots of people are like, this is it, off with their heads. And the truth is, it didn't tell us anything we didn't know. It just gave us names. And so what I'm watching when I saw that article and what I've been watching since, it's not the article. How are people reacting to that article? So that night while I was watching it, at least 3 Democratic Congress people came out and said, this is it. Now we know. And the fact that they were willing to jump on board that suggested to me either that they've gotten smart politically in terms of advertising, or that they might know more than is out there. So I watched that, but you'll notice I didn't write about it. The other things I have watched for are the responses of the people who were named. And those have been really interesting because, first of all, Lauren Boebert from Colorado came out and said, really specifically, I had nothing to do with planning at a certain time. Which, I don't know, that sounds like a kid saying, no, I did not eat the M&Ms. I ate all the Skittles, but I didn't eat the M&Ms. That's what I heard anyway. So Lauren Boebert was interesting. And this morning, Mo Brooks, who was also, I think it was this morning, who was also mentioned in that story, came out and said, I didn't plan. My staff might have, but I didn't plan. Which was an incredibly stupid thing to say, because he's the one who boasted publicly about showing up to talk at the Ellipse that morning in a bulletproof vest. Well, if he didn't think it was going to be bad, why did he wear a bulletproof vest? So that's the kind of stuff that I'm watching, is not the stories, because if you're really watching them closely as I am, we're not seeing a lot new yet, but reactions to them, because the heat's turning up and up and up and up, and it's worth taking a look at how people are reacting. And on this last note, because I got to run, I will say this is one of the reasons I thought that the announcement of Trump doing that new media company was really interesting, because it seemed to me to be a desperate grasp for more money in a hurry before things really hit the fan. It didn't seem like there was any plan or anything. It was just, I'm gonna throw this out there, send me money, and then I'm just gonna grab whatever I can and run. That was my impression. I don't have any inside information on that either, but I just feel like the heat's going up and we need to watch what's happening. All right, on that note, I gotta run across town, and I thank you for being here, and I hope that was useful, and I will see you next week.